In the frozen winter of 1942, across the snow-covered forests of occupied Belarus, a simple piece of scrap metal became the weapon that would terrorize the entire Nazi supply network. This is the true account of how one determined partisan, armed with nothing more than ingenuity and $2 worth of steel, brought the German war machine to its knees by destroying 40 armored trains. This is not a tale of superhuman strength or miraculous intervention. This is a story of human courage, calculated risk, and the kind of quiet determination that changed the course of history, one derailment at a time. If you appreciate stories of real human courage and ingenuity, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us continue bringing you these remarkable true stories. January 1942. The village of Krupki, 30 kilometers northeast of Minsk. The occupation had transformed every aspect of daily life into a struggle for survival. Mikhail Volkov stood in what remained of his family's barn, his breath forming thick clouds in the bitter cold. At 34 years old, he had been a railway maintenance worker before the war, a job that had given him an intimate knowledge of track construction, signal systems, and the vulnerabilities of the rail network that now served as the Wehrmacht's primary supply artery through Belarus. The barn's roof had been partially destroyed during a German artillery barrage 6 months earlier. Snow drifted through the gaps, collecting in the corners where Mikhail's father once stored grain. Now the space held only shadows and memories. Mikhail's wife, Yelena, and their 2 children had been evacuated east in the chaotic first weeks of the invasion, and he had no way of knowing if they had survived the journey. That uncertainty had become a constant weight, heavier than any physical burden he had ever carried. He knelt beside a small metal object he had been shaping for 3 days straight. It was a simple wedge, forged from salvaged rail track metal, carefully hammered and filed into a precise tapered shape. To an untrained eye, it looked like a useless chunk of scrap. To Mikhail, it represented something far more significant. He had spent his entire adult life working on the railways, and he understood their fundamental weakness. Trains, for all their power and armored protection, depended entirely on the integrity of the track beneath them. Disrupt that integrity at the right point in the right way, and even the most heavily armored locomotive would become a twisted wreck. The partisan cell he had joined 2 months earlier consisted of 17 men and 4 women, most of them former soldiers who had escaped encirclement or civilians who had lost everything to the occupation. They operated from a series of concealed camps deep in the Belarusian forests, moving every few days to avoid German sweep operations. Their leader, a former Red Army captain named Dmitry Sokolov, had initially been skeptical of Mikhail's proposal. The previous evening, gathered around a carefully shielded fire in a ravine 5 kilometers from any road, Mikhail had explained his plan to the group. Dmitry sat across from him, his face weathered beyond his 32 years, a long scar running from his left eye to his jawline, a souvenir from the retreat from Smolensk. Dmitry studied the metal wedge Mikhail held up in the firelight. "The shape is too simple," he said, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had seen too many good ideas fail in practice. "The Germans check their tracks constantly. They have security patrols every 2 kilometers. How do you place this without being detected? And even if you succeed, what makes you certain it will work?" Mikhail had anticipated these questions. He set the wedge down on a flat stone and gestured to it. "The Germans check for obvious sabotage," he explained. "Cut rails, missing bolts, explosives. They are not looking for something that appears to be a natural part of the track infrastructure. This wedge is inserted between the rail and the tie plate at a joint point where 2 rail sections meet. From a visual inspection, even from close range, it appears to be part of the fastening system. But what it actually does is create a microscopic elevation of the rail at that specific point. Another partisan, a former schoolteacher named Pyotr, interrupted. Microscopic? How does that derail a locomotive weighing hundreds of tons? Mikhail picked up a stick and began drawing in the frost-covered ground. When a train passes over a normal rail joint, the weight is distributed across multiple ties and fastening points. The joint flexes slightly, but within tolerances the system can handle. However, if one rail is elevated even 10 millimeters higher than its opposite rail at a joint point, something different happens. As the train's wheels pass over that point at speed, the wheel on the elevated side experiences a sudden vertical force, while the opposite wheel is still at the normal height. This creates an instantaneous asymmetric load on the axle. He continued drawing, illustrating the physics of the derailment. For a heavy locomotive traveling at 40 or 50 kilometers per hour, that asymmetric load is enough to begin a cascade failure. The wheel mounts onto the elevated rail. The opposite wheel loses contact with its rail, and the entire bogie begins to twist. Once that twisting motion starts, the momentum of hundreds of tons moving forward ensures the train cannot correct. The locomotive climbs the rail, the following cars jackknife, and the entire train destroys itself. Dmitri remained silent for a long moment, studying the diagram. "The risk is enormous," he finally said. "If you are caught placing this device, the Germans will not simply shoot you. They will torture you until you reveal our location, our numbers, everything. And the reprisals against the local population would be severe." Mikhail met his gaze directly. "I understand the risks, Captain, but consider what we gain. Every train carrying ammunition, fuel, reinforcements or supplies that we destroy weakens the German offensive capability. The Wehrmacht depends on those rail lines. Without them, their entire logistics system in this region fails. This is not about individual heroism. This is about finding an effective method to strike at them repeatedly, with minimal resources and minimal risk of detection." A woman named Katerina, who served as the group's scout, spoke up. "I have been observing the rail line near Boba. There is a curve approximately 8 kilometers east of the station, where the security patrols are less frequent. The track runs through a depression between two hills, and the patrol pattern has a gap of approximately 20 minutes twice each day, once at dawn and once at dusk. If the insertion could be done quickly, that location would offer the best chance." Dmitri looked around at the other faces in the firelight. Each person here had lost family, homes, and their former lives to the invasion. They understood what was being asked. The captain finally nodded. "Very well. We attempt this once. If it succeeds, we evaluate whether to continue. If it fails, or if Mikhail is captured, we move the camp immediately and suspend operations for 2 weeks. Agreed?" The group murmured their agreement. Mikhail felt the weight of their trust settle onto his shoulders alongside the constant weight of not knowing his family's fate. 3 days later, before dawn on a January morning, when the temperature had dropped to minus 23 degrees Celsius, Mikhail lay in a snow-covered depression 50 meters from the rail line near Boba. Katerina crouched beside him, her eyes scanning the tree line in both directions. The cold was so intense that any exposed skin would suffer frostbite within minutes. Mikhail wore layers of salvaged clothing, his hands wrapped in cloth to protect against the metal he would have to handle. The patrol had passed 14 minutes earlier, their breath visible in the darkness as they moved along the track, checking for obvious signs of sabotage. They would not return for at least 15 minutes, possibly 20 if they followed their usual pattern. That was the window. Katerina touched his shoulder. Now. Mikhail moved across the snow, keeping low, his boots crunching softly on the frozen surface. The rail line stretched in both directions, a dark line through the white landscape. He had chosen a joint point where 2 sections of rail met, a location where additional metal fittings would not appear unusual. His hands shook, whether from cold or adrenaline he could not say, as he pulled the wedge from inside his coat, where he had kept it warm enough to handle. The insertion took 47 seconds. He positioned the wedge between the rail and the tie plate, using a small hammer wrapped in cloth to tap it into place. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the frozen silence, each impact like a gunshot to his heightened senses. But he knew from experience that sound did not travel far in these conditions, absorbed by the snow and the forest surrounding them. When the wedge was seated properly, he used handfuls of snow and dirt to disguise the fresh disturbance, making it appear as though nothing had been touched. From 5 meters away, even in good light, the wedge would be nearly invisible. From the cursory inspection a patrol would give while walking past, it would be completely undetectable. Katerina whistled softly, the signal that time was running short. Mikhail scrambled back to the depression, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. They lay in the snow, waiting, as the patrol appeared again in the distance, their silhouettes dark against the pre-dawn grey. The Germans passed within 30 meters of where Mikhail and Katerina hid, close enough that they could hear fragments of conversation, complaints about the cold and speculation about when they might be rotated back to Warsaw. When the patrol had disappeared around the curve, Mikhail and Katerina retreated through the forest to where the rest of their group waited. "Now we wait," Dmitri said when they reported back. "If a train passes before the next patrol, we will know if the method works." They did not have to wait long. At 9:47 that morning, the sound of a locomotive echoed through the forest. The partisan group had positioned themselves on a hillside with a clear view of the section of track where Mikhail had placed the wedge. Through a salvaged pair of binoculars, they watched as the train approached, a German supply train consisting of a locomotive and 11 freight cars, likely carrying ammunition and equipment for the front lines. The locomotive hit the compromised joint at approximately 45 kilometers per hour. For a fraction of a second, nothing appeared to happen. Then the lead truck of the locomotive lifted slightly as the wheel mounted the elevated rail. The movement was subtle, barely visible, but the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The front of the locomotive twisted to the right, the wheels on that side climbing over the rail completely. The massive weight and forward momentum ensured that there was no possibility of recovery. The locomotive pitched sideways, dragging the first 3 freight cars with it in a cascading failure. The sound of tearing metal and splintering wood echoed across the frozen landscape as the train destroyed itself, cars piling into each other, ammunition crates spilling across the snow. Through the binoculars, Mikhail watched as German soldiers who had been riding in the rear cars scrambled out, some injured, all clearly shocked by what had happened. Within minutes, the wreckage was surrounded by personnel trying to understand the cause of the derailment. Mikhail knew they would search for explosives, for cut rails, for obvious signs of sabotage. They would not find any of those things. The wedge, now buried under tons of twisted metal, would appear to be just another piece of debris if anyone even noticed it at all. Dmitri lowered the binoculars and looked at Mikhail with an expression that combined respect and something darker. The recognition of how much damage they could do with this method. "It works," the captain said quietly, "which means we need more wedges, more locations, and more careful planning. This is going to change everything." Over the following weeks, Mikhail trained 4 other members of the partisan group in the precise technique of placing the wedges. Each person needed to understand not just the mechanical process, but the critical importance of choosing the right location, the right type of joint, and the right timing. A wedge placed incorrectly would either be ineffective or worse, obvious to inspectors, which would alert the Germans to the tactic and end its usefulness. The group established a pattern of targeting different sections of the rail network, never striking the same area twice in succession. varying the time between attacks to prevent the Germans from predicting when and where the next derailment would occur. Mikhail forged new wedges in hidden locations, sometimes working through the night in abandoned buildings or deep forest camps where the sound of his hammer would not carry. By March 1942, they had successfully derailed 7 trains. Each derailment created chaos in the German supply network. Equipment and ammunition intended for the front lines never arrived. Locomotives and freight cars that the Wehrmacht could not afford to lose sat as twisted wreckage along the rail corridors. Most importantly, the Germans could not understand how it was happening. Their security was increased. Patrols became more frequent, entire sections of track were inspected daily, but the derailments continued. Mikhail developed refinements to the technique. He learned to identify the specific types of rail joints that were most vulnerable, the exact placement that would maximize the derailment effect, and how to disguise the wedges even more effectively. He also learned which weather conditions made the placement safer, how to read the patrol patterns, and how to minimize the time exposed during insertion. In April, the group expanded their operations, coordinating with other partisan cells in the region. Mikhail traveled to 3 different groups, training them in the wedge technique. The knowledge spread through the resistance network like a carefully guarded secret, each cell operating independently but using the same fundamental method. By summer 1942, derailments were occurring across a 200-kilometer stretch of the Belarusian rail network, and the German command was becoming increasingly desperate to find the cause. The cost of these successes was not borne solely by the Germans. In May, after a particularly devastating derailment that destroyed an armored train carrying tanks to the front, the Wehrmacht launched a massive reprisal operation. 3 villages suspected of harboring partisans were burned completely. Over 200 civilians were executed. The orders were explicit: terrorize the population until someone revealed information about the saboteurs. Mikhail learned of the reprisals from a refugee who stumbled into their camp, a woman named Olga, whose entire family had been killed when the Germans set fire to her village. She sat by the fire, her eyes empty, describing how the soldiers had gathered everyone in the town square and demanded information about partisan activities. When no one could or would provide useful intelligence, the commanding officer had selected every 5th person and had them shot on the spot. The rest were locked in their homes, and the entire village was set ablaze. That night, Mikhail could not sleep. He sat apart from the camp, staring into the darkness, questioning whether the damage they were inflicting on the German supply network justified the horrific price being paid by innocent civilians. Dmitri found him there as dawn approached, the captain's face as troubled as Mikhail's. "I know what you are thinking," Dmitri said, sitting down beside him. "I think it every day. But you must understand something crucial. The Germans do not need a reason to commit these atrocities. They are not responding to our actions with proportional force. They are implementing a policy of deliberate terror, regardless of what we do or do not do. If we stopped all resistance tomorrow, the killings would continue because their objective is to subjugate and eliminate the population they consider subhuman." Mikhail turned to look at him. "How do you carry that knowledge? How do you continue, knowing that people die because of what we do?" The captain was silent for a long moment. "I carry it by remembering that the only thing worse than fighting and losing would be not fighting at all. Every train we destroy weakens their ability to wage war. Every locomotive that lies as wreckage is one less piece of equipment they can use to kill Soviet soldiers at the front, to bomb our cities, to maintain their occupation. The arithmetic is brutal, but it is real. We are saving more lives than we cost by making it harder for them to sustain their war machine." In June, Mikhail received information that changed everything. A partisan who worked as a forced laborer at a German administrative facility in Minsk had managed to copy a transportation schedule. The document detailed a special train that would pass through the region in 2 weeks, carrying high-ranking officers and technical specialists to a conference in Smolensk. The train would be heavily guarded, traveling at higher speed than normal supply trains, and its route would include a section of track that Mikhail had identified as particularly vulnerable to the wedge technique. The partisan command debated the wisdom of targeting such a high-value train. The security would be extraordinary, the reprisals would be severe, and the risk of failure was significant. But the potential impact was equally significant. Eliminating or even delaying a group of high-ranking officers and technical specialists could disrupt German operations far beyond the simple destruction of supplies. Mikhail studied the route information carefully. The train would pass through a section of track near Orsha, where there was a gradual curve, followed by a bridge over a small river. If a wedge could be placed at the joint, just before the curve, the derailment would send the train off the track at the worst possible location, with the momentum carrying the locomotive and forward cars over the embankment and potentially into the river. The bridge was not designed to handle a derailment impact, and the entire structure might collapse, further complicating German recovery efforts. The plan was approved, but with significant modifications to the usual procedure. Instead of a single partisan placing the wedge, they would send a team of 4 with extensive planning for contingencies and escape routes. Katerina would scout the location for 3 days prior to the operation, mapping the patrol patterns down to the minute. They would have 2 wedges prepared in case the first was dropped or damaged during placement, and they would have a diversionary action planned for 10 kilometers away to draw German attention if anything went wrong. The night before the operation, Mikhail sat with his tools, checking the wedges one final time. Pyotr, the former schoolteacher, sat nearby, cleaning a rifle that he hoped he would not have to use. The 2 men had become close over the months of working together, bound by the shared weight of what they were doing. "Do you think about what happens after the war?" Pyotr asked quietly. "Do you imagine going back to a normal life?" Mikhail continued his careful inspection of the metal wedge, running his fingers along the tapered edge. "Every day," he said, "I think about finding my wife and children, if they survived. I think about rebuilding our home, working on the railways again in peacetime, seeing trains carry passengers and goods instead of weapons and soldiers. But I also know that the person who does those things, if I survive to do them, will not be the same person who worked on those railways before the war. Too much has changed. Too much has been lost." Pyotr nodded slowly. "I used to teach literature," he said. "I would help children understand poetry, appreciate the beauty in language, imagine futures full of possibilities. Now I teach people how to move silently through forests and identify German patrol patterns. I am not sure I can go back to being that other person, even if the war ends tomorrow." The following evening, the team moved into position. Katerina had confirmed that the patrol schedule remained consistent, with a 22-minute gap that would provide adequate time for the insertion. The weather was cooperating, with low clouds and intermittent drizzle that reduced visibility and helped mask any sounds of movement. Mikhail approached the track with Pyotr beside him, while 2 other partisans maintained watch positions 50 meters away in opposite directions. The location was exactly as Katerina had described. A joint point 30 meters before the curve, where the track began its gradual turn toward the bridge. The tie plates here were slightly older, showing signs of wear that would help disguise the presence of an additional metal component. The insertion went smoothly, taking less than 1 minute. The wedge seated perfectly, and Mikhail carefully disguised the disturbance with natural materials that would not appear suspicious. As they retreated to the tree line, Mikhail felt the familiar combination of relief and anticipation, knowing that the next several hours would determine whether the operation succeeded or failed. The special train was scheduled to pass through at 4:30 in the afternoon the following day. The partisan group positioned themselves in a heavily concealed location on a hillside that provided a clear view of both the track and the bridge. Through binoculars, they watched as increased German security forces moved through the area, checking the track, positioning guards at intervals, taking the threat of sabotage seriously but not knowing what to look for. At 4:28, the train appeared in the distance. It was moving faster than the typical supply trains, the locomotive pulling 6 passenger cars that likely held the officers and specialists, followed by 2 armored cars with visible defensive positions. The security was exactly as the intelligence had suggested, substantial and professional. Mikhail held the binoculars, his hands steady despite the tension, watching as the locomotive approached the compromised joint. Time seemed to slow as the train reached the critical point. The front wheels of the locomotive passed over the wedge, the slight elevation barely visible. Then the cascade began, exactly as Mikhail had calculated. The lead truck lifted, the wheel mounted the rail, and the massive weight of the locomotive began its sideways rotation. The engineer must have realized something was catastrophically wrong because there was a sudden screaming of brakes, steam venting from the emergency release, but it was far too late. The momentum carried the locomotive off the track, dragging the first 4 passenger cars with it. The train plowed into the embankment at the beginning of the curve, the locomotive rolling completely over and sliding down toward the river, passenger cars jackknifing and crushing against each other, the sounds of destruction echoing across the landscape. The 2 rear passenger cars and the armored cars managed to brake before being pulled into the disaster, but the damage to the front of the train was total. Through the binoculars, Mikhail could see German soldiers scrambling from the surviving cars, some moving to help survivors in the wreckage, others immediately taking defensive positions, assuming an attack might follow. Dmitri, watching through a second pair of binoculars, quietly gave the order to withdraw. The operation was complete, and there was nothing to be gained by remaining in the area where German reinforcements would soon flood the region. The partisan group retreated deep into the forest, moving through carefully planned routes that left minimal trace. They did not know precisely what they had achieved beyond the obvious destruction of the train, but they knew it was significant. Within days, information filtered back through the network of resistance contacts and sympathizers. The train had carried 23 officers, including 2 generals and several technical specialists working on logistics and communication systems. 14 of them had been killed in the derailment, including one of the generals. The others were injured to varying degrees. The conference in Smolensk had to be postponed, and more importantly, the German command's confidence in their rail security had been shattered. The reprisals were immediate and brutal. German forces swept through the region, arresting hundreds of people on suspicion of partisan activities or sympathy. Villages were burned, hostages were executed. The occupation authorities offered substantial rewards for information leading to the capture of saboteurs, and they implemented new security measures that made the partisan operations significantly more dangerous. But they still did not understand the method. The wedge had been buried under tons of wreckage and river mud, just another piece of debris in the massive cleanup operation. German investigators assumed the derailment had been caused by explosives they simply had not found, or by some sophisticated sabotage technique they did not yet comprehend. They increased patrols, installed more monitoring stations, brought in specialized security units, but these measures could not protect against a threat they did not understand. Through the summer and fall of 1942, Mikhail and the expanded network of trained partisans continued their campaign. They derailed supply trains carrying fuel and ammunition. They destroyed equipment transports, moving tanks and artillery to the front. They disrupted troop movements, forcing German units to be delayed or rerouted. Each derailment created ripples through the Wehrmacht's carefully planned logistics system. By November, Mikhail had personally placed wedges that resulted in 17 derailments. The partisans he had trained accounted for another 23, 40 trains in total, carrying supplies, equipment, and personnel that never reached their intended destinations. The cumulative impact was substantial enough that German field commanders in the region began to complain that they could not rely on rail transport, that critical supplies were delayed or never arrived, that the entire logistics network in Belarus had become unreliable. Mikhail kept a careful mental count of each derailment, not out of pride, but as a form of remembrance. Each train represented a specific night spent forging a wedge, a dangerous insertion under threat of discovery, hours of tension waiting to see if the method would work. Each one also represented the civilians who died in reprisals, the burned villages, the executed hostages. The arithmetic that Dmitri had spoken about was never simple, never clean. In December 1942, Mikhail received news that changed everything. A woman traveling through the partisan network carried messages from the east, information gathered from refugees and evacuees. Among the names on her list was Yelena Volkov, his wife. She was alive, living in a collective farm near Kazan with their 2 children. The message was months old, and there was no guarantee they were still there or still alive, but it was the first real information Mikhail had received in 18 months. That night, he sat with Dmitri and admitted something he had not voiced before. "I need to believe I will see them again," he said. "Every time I place one of these wedges, every time I risk being caught, I do it believing that somehow I will survive this war and find my family. But I am also starting to understand that the person they knew, the husband and father who worked on the railways and came home each evening, that person died somewhere along the way. I do not know if the man I have become is someone they could recognize or accept." Dmitri, whose own family had been killed in the first month of the invasion, considered this carefully. "You are not the same person," he agreed. "None of us are. War does that. It breaks us down and reassembles us into something different, something capable of doing what must be done. But that does not mean you are unrecognizable. The core of who you are, the things you value, the reasons you fight, those have not changed. You fight so that they might live, so that the occupation might end, so that there might be a future where normal life is possible again. That is not the work of a monster or a stranger. That is the work of someone who loves his family enough to become whatever is necessary to protect them." The winter of 1942 brought new challenges. The extreme cold made operations more difficult, the shortened days provided less cover for movement, and the Germans had adapted their security procedures in ways that made wedge placement more risky. But the partisan operations continued, each derailment a small victory in a larger struggle that seemed to have no end in sight. By January 1943, Mikhail had trained 11 people in the wedge technique. Some operated with his group, others had returned to their own partisan cells to share the knowledge. The method had spread far enough that derailments were occurring across a region stretching from Vitebsk to Gomel, a distance of over 300 kilometers. The German command knew they were facing a coordinated sabotage campaign, but they still could not identify the specific technique being used. In February, Mikhail led an operation against a heavily defended rail junction near Orsha. The target was a switching yard where trains were assembled and reorganized before continuing to the front. A successful derailment here would not only destroy a single train, but potentially damage the switching infrastructure, creating a bottleneck that would affect dozens of trains. The operation required 8 partisans working in coordination, 4 teams of 2 placing wedges at different points in the yard. The security was intense, with floodlights illuminating portions of the yard and guard posts every 100 meters. But Katerina had identified weaknesses in the patrol coverage, brief windows when specific sections would be unwatched for 2 or 3 minutes. The teams moved into position on a moonless night, with snow falling heavily enough to help obscure their movements. Mikhail and Pyotr took the most dangerous placement, a joint near the main switching point, where a derailment would cause maximum damage. The floodlights cast stark shadows across the snow, and they could hear German voices clearly from the nearest guard post. The insertion took 90 seconds, longer than usual, because of the complexity of the location and the need for absolute silence. When Mikhail signaled completion, they retreated through the shadows to the rally point where the other teams were already waiting. All 4 wedges had been successfully placed. Now they needed to get clear of the area before dawn patrol. The first derailment occurred at 6:45 the next morning, when a supply train moving through the switching yard hit one of the prepared joints. The locomotive derailed directly onto a parallel track, blocking both lines. 3 hours later, as German engineers were still trying to clear the wreckage, a second train hit another prepared joint, this one carrying fuel. The resulting fire destroyed the train and damaged portions of the switching infrastructure. By late afternoon, the entire yard was shut down, and rail traffic through Orsha had been completely disrupted. The Germans responded with a massive sweep operation, flooding the region with troops searching for the saboteurs. Mikhail's group was forced to move their camp 3 times in 5 days, constantly staying ahead of the search parties. 2 partisan groups in the region were discovered and destroyed, with only a handful of survivors managing to escape. The price of success was measured not just in German losses, but in the constant danger and sacrifice of those fighting the occupation. Through the spring and summer of 1943, as the broader war began to turn against Germany, with defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, the partisan campaign in Belarus intensified. Mikhail continued to refine his technique, developing new variations for different types of track and different tactical situations. He trained more partisans, shared intelligence about German patrol patterns and security measures, and coordinated with other cells to maximize the impact of their operations. By September 1943, Mikhail had personally placed wedges that resulted in 31 derailments. The partisans he had trained accounted for dozens more. The cumulative impact on German logistics in the region was severe enough that Wehrmacht commanders began to demand additional security forces that had to be diverted from the front lines at a time when every soldier was needed to counter the Soviet offensive. But the cost of this campaign was visible in Mikhail's face, in the deep lines around his eyes, in the way his hands sometimes shook after an operation, in the moments when he would stare into the darkness and see the faces of all the people who had died, both German and civilian, as a consequence of this war. He was 36 years old, but he looked a decade older, worn down by the constant stress, the inadequate food, the exposure to extreme weather, and the accumulated weight of all he had done and witnessed. In October, during a rare moment of quiet in their forest camp, Pyotr asked him a question that had been weighing on many minds. When the war ends, when we have driven them out or they have been defeated, what do we tell people about what we did here? How do we explain the derailments, the reprisals, the choices we made? Mikhail considered the question for a long time before answering. We tell them the truth, he finally said. Not the sanitized version, not the heroic story that makes it all seem noble and clean. We tell them that we fought because the alternative was to accept subjugation and death. We tell them that innocent people died, that we made choices that had terrible consequences, that there was no way to fight this war without causing suffering. We tell them that we did what we believed was necessary, knowing that history would judge whether those beliefs were correct. He paused, staring into the small fire they had carefully shielded. And we tell them that we lived with the weight of those choices every single day, that we paid a price for this resistance that goes beyond the physical danger. We paid it in nightmares, in guilt, in the knowledge that we can never return to being the people we were before all of this began. That is the truth of what we did here. The winter of 1943 moved into the spring of 1944, and the strategic situation began to shift dramatically. The Red Army was advancing, pushing the Germans back across the vast territory they had conquered. Belarus, which had suffered under occupation longer than almost any other region, was approaching liberation. But that liberation would come at tremendous cost, and the partisan operations became even more critical in supporting the Soviet offensive. Mikhail's group received orders to intensify their attacks on the rail network, targeting not just supply trains, but any German transport that could be used to move forces or equipment to counter the Soviet advance. The number of operations increased, and with it, the risks. German security forces, increasingly desperate as their strategic position deteriorated, became more brutal in their reprisals and more aggressive in their pursuit of partisan groups. In May 1944, Mikhail led what would be his final wedge operation. A German armored train was scheduled to move through their region, carrying tanks and infantry to reinforce the crumbling defensive lines. The train represented a significant military asset, and its destruction would help the Soviet forces that were now less than 40 kilometers away. The operation site was a curve in the track near a small bridge, a location Mikhail had identified weeks earlier as optimal for the wedge technique. The security was heavier than they had ever encountered, with patrols every 10 minutes and observation posts with clear views of long stretches of track. Katerina had worked for 3 days to map a possible insertion window, a 5-minute gap that occurred when patrol rotations overlapped and the observation posts changed guards. The night before the operation, the partisan group gathered to review the plan one final time. Dmitri spread out a hand-drawn map on a flat section of ground, the details memorized by everyone present, but the ritual of review having become a crucial part of their preparation. The captain's finger traced the route they would take through the forest, the approach to the rail line, the fallback positions if things went wrong. A young partisan named Ivan, who had joined the group only 3 months earlier after his entire family was killed in a reprisal action, spoke up with a question that had been troubling him. If the train is carrying so many troops and such heavy armor, what happens if they survive the derailment in significant numbers? What happens if they come after us immediately while we are still in the area? It was Pyotr who answered, his voice carrying the weight of experience earned through 2 years of operations. If they come after us, we scatter according to the plan. We do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Our value is not in fighting pitched battles against superior forces. Our value is in continuing to operate, continuing to disrupt their logistics, continuing to make this occupation cost them more than they can afford to pay. 1 derailment matters, but 40 derailments matter far more. We survive to fight again, always. Mikhail added his own perspective, speaking quietly but with conviction that came from having lived with these decisions for so long. The goal is never to kill German soldiers, he said. The goal is to destroy their ability to wage war effectively in this region. Every ton of supplies that does not reach the front, every replacement part that sits in twisted wreckage instead of being installed in a tank, every hour of delay we create in their transportation network, these things save Soviet lives and bring the liberation closer. We are not heroes engaging in glorious combat. We are mechanics, removing essential components from a machine until it can no longer function. The group settled into an uneasy silence, each person dealing with their own thoughts about what the next day would bring. Katerina sat apart from the others, checking and rechecking her equipment with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through dozens of reconnaissance missions. She was 24 years old, though the war had aged her beyond those years. Before the invasion, she had been a university student in Minsk, studying languages and dreaming of becoming a translator. Now she moved through forests like a ghost, reading German patrol patterns the way she had once read French poetry. Mikhail found himself unable to sleep that night, his mind racing through the countless variables that could affect the operation. The weather forecast was uncertain, with possible rain that could either help by reducing visibility or hurt by making the track approaches more treacherous. The intelligence about the armored train was days old, and there was always the possibility that schedules had changed, that the train had been rerouted, that they would risk everything for a target that would never materialize. He thought about his family, as he did every night, constructing elaborate fantasies about what they might be doing at that exact moment. Were his children sleeping peacefully? Or did they have nightmares about the evacuation, about the bombing runs, about the separation from their father? Did Yelena still think of him? Or had she begun the process of accepting that he might never return, that she might need to build a life without him? These thoughts were dangerous, he knew. They could undermine the focus necessary for operations like the one they would attempt the next day. But they were also essential, the connection to who he had been and who he hoped to become again once the war ended. Without those thoughts, without that connection to a life beyond resistance and sabotage, he feared he would become something less than human, a creature of violence and destruction with no path back to normalcy. As dawn approached, the partisan group began their final preparations. Weapons were checked and secured, not because they planned to use them, but because being caught without them was suicide. Each person carried minimal supplies, knowing that speed and stealth would matter far more than equipment if anything went wrong. Mikhail placed the wedge inside his coat, keeping it close to his body where it would not shift or make noise during movement. The journey to the operation site took 3 hours, moving carefully through terrain they had scouted repeatedly. The spring forest was coming alive with new growth, birch trees showing the first pale green of leaves, the forest floor covered with plants emerging from the long winter. In different circumstances, it would have been beautiful. But for the partisans, the new growth meant less concealment, more risk of being spotted by patrols or observation aircraft. They reached their staging position with an hour to spare before the planned insertion window. Mikhail used the time to observe the German security patterns one final time, confirming that Katerina's intelligence remained accurate. The observation posts were exactly where she had indicated. The patrol timing matched her predictions, and the insertion point appeared accessible during the brief window they had identified. But as the time approached, Mikhail noticed something that made his blood run cold. A German officer had arrived at the nearest observation post and was speaking with the guards, gesturing toward the track. The conversation went on for several minutes, and then the officer departed, walking along the track in the direction of the insertion point. Was this a routine inspection, or had something alerted them to possible sabotage in this area? Dmitri, observing through binoculars from a concealed position, made the decision that every partisan commander dreaded. He signaled to abort the operation. The risk had become too high, the variables too uncertain. They would retreat, regroup, and attempt the operation another day if the opportunity presented itself. But Mikhail, watching the German officer through his own position closer to the track, saw something different. The officer was not conducting a careful inspection. He was simply walking, smoking a cigarette, taking a few minutes away from his duties. Within 2 minutes, the man had turned around and headed back toward the observation post, disappearing inside. The insertion window was still viable, though shortened by several crucial minutes. Mikhail made a decision that went against his training, against protocol, against the collective agreement of the group. He moved forward alone toward the insertion point, knowing that Dmitri would either have to support the operation or watch it fail. It was a calculated gamble, based on his assessment that the opportunity was too valuable to waste, that the armored train represented enough military value to justify the additional risk. He reached the track with less than 3 minutes remaining in the insertion window. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 40 times before, placing the wedge, seating it properly, beginning the camouflage process. But the shortened time meant he could not be as thorough as usual. The disguise was adequate but not perfect, noticeable to someone conducting a close inspection, but likely sufficient for the routine patrol that would pass by. Mikhail and 3 other partisans moved into position, crawling through muddy ground to reach the track. The spring thaw had made the terrain treacherous, and every movement risked creating noise that would alert the German forces nearby. When they reached the insertion point, Mikhail saw immediately that the conditions were not ideal. Water had accumulated around the joint, and the ground was softer than expected, which would make it harder to disguise the wedge placement. But the window was closing, and there would be no other opportunity before the train passed through. Mikhail made the decision to proceed, working quickly but carefully to seat the wedge and camouflage it as well as possible given the conditions. As he finished, they heard voices approaching, the patrol returning earlier than expected. The 4 partisans pressed themselves into the muddy depression beside the track, barely breathing as German soldiers passed within meters of their position, close enough that Mikhail could have reached out and touched the nearest man's boots. When the patrol had passed, they retreated as quickly as stealth would allow, their clothing caked with mud, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. From their observation position on a hillside, they watched as the armored train approached several hours later, moving at moderate speed, its flat cars carrying tanks secured with chains, infantry visible in the protected cars between the armored sections. The derailment was spectacular and terrible. The locomotive hit the compromised joint and began its immediate climb off the rail. The speed and weight of the armored train ensured a catastrophic failure, the locomotive rolling completely over, dragging 2 flat cars with it into a ravine beside the track, tanks breaking loose from their chains and tumbling like toys. The remaining cars piled into each other, the sounds of destruction echoing across the landscape for what seemed like minutes. The devastation was more complete than Mikhail had anticipated. 3 of the tanks had broken completely free from their securing chains during the derailment, tumbling down the ravine and coming to rest at impossible angles, their tracks torn loose, their main guns bent or broken. The infantry cars had compressed like accordions, the armored plating that was meant to protect the soldiers instead becoming a death trap as the cars folded inward on themselves. Smoke rose from multiple points in the wreckage where fuel lines had ruptured and ignited. Through the binoculars, Mikhail could see individual German soldiers staggering from the surviving rear cars, their movements conveying shock and confusion. Some collapsed immediately upon exiting, injured by the violent deceleration or by debris that had torn through the cars. Others moved more purposefully, attempting to establish a defensive perimeter even as they dealt with the catastrophic loss of their equipment and comrades. A German officer, identifiable by his distinctive uniform even at this distance, was directing the survivors to establish security positions. The man moved with the mechanical efficiency of professional military training, compartmentalizing the disaster and focusing on immediate tactical necessities. Mikhail felt a strange respect for this enemy he had just struck, recognizing in the officer's actions the same discipline and focus that allowed him to function despite the moral weight of what he himself had done. Pyotr, lying beside him in the observation position, whispered a question. Do you think about them, the individual soldiers in those trains? Do you wonder who they were, what lives they had before the war? Mikhail lowered the binoculars and considered the question carefully. "Every day," he answered honestly. "I think about all of it. I think about the German conscript who might have been a farmer in Bavaria, who never wanted to invade anyone but was drafted and given no choice. I think about whether he had a family waiting for news of him, whether his death in this ravine will destroy other lives beyond his own. But I also think about what that soldier was doing here, about the role he was playing in an occupation that has killed hundreds of thousands of our people, about the supplies he was helping to transport that would have been used to kill more Soviet soldiers and prolong this nightmare." He paused, watching as more German personnel arrived at the wreck site, beginning the long process of recovery and investigation. "The question is not whether I think about them," he continued. "The question is whether thinking about them should change what I do, and the only answer I can live with is no. I can acknowledge their humanity. I can recognize that many of them are victims of this war in their own way, but I cannot let that recognition prevent me from doing what must be done to end the occupation. That is the burden we carry. That is what makes us different from them. We kill, but we do so understanding the full weight of what we are doing, not as enthusiastic participants in conquest, but as desperate people defending what remains of our lives." Dmitri gave the signal to withdraw, and the partisan group began their carefully planned retreat through the forest. They moved in silence, each person processing what they had witnessed, adding this 40th derailment to the accumulated weight of all that had come before. The journey back to their camp would take most of the day, following circuitous routes designed to leave no clear trail for German forces to follow. As they moved through the spring forest, Mikhail found himself reflecting on how much had changed since that first derailment over 2 years earlier. The technique that had started as an experiment, a desperate attempt to find some way to strike back against an occupier that seemed invincible, had evolved into a systematic campaign that had genuinely impacted German operations in the region. The Wehrmacht had been forced to divert resources to rail security that they desperately needed elsewhere. They had lost irreplaceable equipment and supplies. They had seen their carefully constructed logistics network become unreliable, forcing them to adapt tactics and strategies in ways that benefited the Soviet forces pushing westward. But the cost of these successes was written in scars across the Belarusian landscape. Villages that no longer existed, populations decimated by reprisals, families torn apart, children orphaned, the innocent and the guilty dying together in a conflagration that made no meaningful distinction between them. Mikhail had long since abandoned any illusion that resistance was noble or heroic. It was simply necessary, the only alternative to submission, and it came with a price that would be paid for generations. When they reached their camp, deep in a forested area that had served as their base for 3 weeks, Mikhail immediately began preparing a detailed report of the operation. The partisan command structure, such as it was, required documentation of significant actions. The report would eventually make its way through the network to Soviet military intelligence, contributing to the larger picture of German capabilities and vulnerabilities in the region. Writing the report forced Mikhail to confront the details of what he had done, to describe in clear language the placement of the wedge, the observation of the derailment, the estimated casualties and equipment losses. It was one thing to carry out these operations in the heat of the moment, driven by adrenaline and focus. It was another thing entirely to sit in the quiet aftermath and document the destruction in clinical terms. Over the following days, information filtered back through the partisan network about the impact of the armored train derailment. The loss of those 3 tanks was significant, as German armor in the region was already stretched thin by the Soviet advance. The infantry casualties had been severe, with over 40 soldiers killed and many more injured. But perhaps more importantly, the derailment had created a major bottleneck in the rail line that took 5 days to clear. during which time no trains could pass through that section of track. Those 5 days of disruption rippled through the entire logistics network, delaying supplies and reinforcements to multiple German units. The partisan command sent word that Mikhail's work over the past 2 years had been recognized at the highest levels. There was talk of medals, of commendations, of recognition after the war. But Mikhail found these notifications hollow. He had not done this work for recognition or glory. He had done it because someone needed to, because he had the knowledge and skills to do it effectively, because every day the occupation continued was another day of suffering for people who deserved better. Mikhail watched through binoculars as the German forces that survived scrambled to secure the area and help the injured. He watched as the massive cleanup operation began, cranes and equipment being brought in to clear the wreckage. He watched and counted the cost in his mind: 40 derailments, 40 trains destroyed or severely damaged, tens of thousands of tons of supplies and equipment that never reached their intended destinations, hundreds of German soldiers killed or injured in the derailments, and an unknowable number of Soviet soldiers at the front who survived because those supplies never arrived. But he also counted the other cost: the villages burned, the civilians executed, the refugees fleeing through forests, the partisan fighters captured and tortured, the constant fear and hardship of occupation. The arithmetic that Dmitri had spoken of years earlier remained as complex and morally ambiguous as ever. 3 weeks after that final operation, the Red Army liberated the region. Mikhail and his partisan group made contact with the advancing Soviet forces, providing intelligence about German positions and movements, helping coordinate the final push that drove the Wehrmacht out of Belarus. The occupation was ending, though the war would continue for another year before final victory in Berlin. After the liberation, Mikhail received permission to travel east to search for his family. The journey took weeks, traveling through a landscape scarred by years of war, past destroyed villages and burned forests, through regions still recovering from the trauma of occupation. When he finally reached the collective farm near Kazan, where Yelena had been reported to be living, he found them, his wife and children, older and changed by their own experiences of evacuation and hardship, but alive. The reunion was more complicated than the simple joy he had imagined during all those nights in partisan camps. His daughter Anna, now 10 years old, looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, not quite certain who this thin, scarred stranger was. His son Dmitri, named after the partisan captain who had died 3 months before liberation, hid partially behind his mother, uncertain and afraid. They had been so young when he last saw them, their memories of him fragmentary at best, overlaid now with years of his absence. Yelena looked at him standing in the doorway of their small room, and she saw in his face all the years of separation, all the weight he had carried. She said nothing at first, just stepped forward and held him while he wept, the first tears he had allowed himself since the war began. His children, now 8 and 10 years old, watched uncertainly, not quite recognizing this thin, weathered man as the father they barely remembered. The process of rebuilding their family was slow and often painful. Mikhail discovered that he had become a stranger in his own home, that the easy intimacy he had shared with Yelena before the war had been replaced by a careful distance neither of them knew how to bridge. She would wake in the night to find him sitting by the window, staring into darkness, and she learned not to ask what he was thinking about. He would flinch at sudden noises, would fall into long silences that she could not penetrate, would sometimes look at their children with an expression of such profound sadness that it frightened her. The children adapted in their own ways. Anna, who was older and remembered more of life before the war, made a conscious effort to know this father who had returned to them. She would sit beside him and talk about small things, about school and friends and the daily minutiae of life on the collective farm, asking nothing of him but his presence. Slowly, across weeks and months, she began to reach the man hidden beneath the layers of trauma and memory. Young Dmitri was more cautious, taking longer to trust this person who claimed to be his father but felt like a stranger. Mikhail did not push, understanding that trust would have to be earned, that he had lost years with his son that could never be recovered. He simply tried to be present, to be reliable, to show through actions rather than words that he was committed to being part of their lives again. In the months that followed, as they began the slow process of rebuilding their lives, Mikhail told Yelena some of what he had done during the war. Not everything, not the details that would haunt dreams, but enough that she could understand what those years had cost him. She listened without judgment, holding his hand as he spoke, accepting that the man she had married and the man who had returned were both the same person, and somehow different. One evening, several months after his return, Yelena asked him a question she had been holding back. "Do you regret it? Do you regret choosing to fight instead of trying to flee east with us, or hiding or finding some other way to survive?" Mikhail considered the question for a long time before responding. "Regret is too simple a word for what I feel," he said finally. "I regret every death that resulted from what we did, every village burned in reprisal, every civilian executed because the Germans could not find us. I regret the years I lost with you and the children, years I can never have back. I regret what the war made me become, the things I had to do and see and accept as necessary. But I do not regret fighting. I do not regret trying to end the occupation in the only way that seemed possible. If I had chosen differently, if I had tried to hide or flee, I would have carried a different kind of weight, the weight of having done nothing while others fought and died. I am not certain which weight would have been heavier." Yelena absorbed this, her own experiences of the war having taught her that there were no good choices, only different kinds of sacrifice. She told him about the evacuation, about the chaos and terror of fleeing the advancing German forces, about the months of hunger and cold in the overcrowded evacuation centers, about the constant uncertainty of whether they would survive each day. She told him about the other women she had met, some of whom had lost everything, some of whom would never see their families again. She helped him understand that the war had taken a toll on everyone, that he was not alone in carrying scars, that survival itself had been a form of resistance. The Soviet authorities wanted to celebrate the partisan campaign, to turn the fighters into heroes of the great patriotic war. There were ceremonies and medals, official recognition of the role resistance forces had played in weakening German logistics and supporting the Red Army advance. Mikhail attended some of these events, standing alongside other former partisans, accepting commendations that felt strange and uncomfortable. At one such ceremony in Minsk, held in a building that had been partially rebuilt after the devastation of the war, a Soviet general gave a speech about the partisan resistance, praising their courage and sacrifice. The general spoke of the thousands of German trains that had been derailed, the massive disruption to Wehrmacht logistics, the contribution this had made to ultimate victory. The numbers were impressive, perhaps somewhat inflated for propaganda purposes, but grounded in real achievements. After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared stories, Mikhail found himself in conversation with other partisans who had used the wedge technique he had developed and taught. They spoke about specific operations, about close calls and successful derailments, about the constant fear and the occasional exhilaration of striking back against the occupiers. But they also spoke more quietly about the cost, about the friends they had lost, the civilians who had died in reprisals, the moral weight of decisions made in impossible circumstances. One former partisan, a woman named Irina who had operated south of Minsk, pulled Mikhail aside and thanked him for the training he had provided. "Your technique saved my life more than once," she said. "It gave us a way to fight that did not require suicide missions or direct confrontation with superior forces." But she also asked him a question that had been troubling her. How do we live with what we did? How do we return to normal life, knowing what we are capable of, what we have done? Mikhail had no easy answer for her. "We live with it by acknowledging it," he said. "We do not pretend it did not happen. We do not claim we were simply following orders or that we had no choice. We accept that we made decisions, that those decisions had consequences, and we carry the weight of those consequences. We also remember why we fought, what we were trying to protect, what we hoped to achieve, and we try to build lives that honor the sacrifice of those who did not survive, lives that justify the violence we committed in the name of liberation." He never forgot the 40 trains, the wedges he had carefully crafted and placed, the derailments he had caused. The memories were part of him now, woven into the fabric of who he had become. But they were also part of a larger story. The story of how ordinary people facing impossible circumstances had found ways to resist, to fight back, to make the occupation as difficult and costly as possible for an invader that had seemed unstoppable. Years later, when people asked Mikhail about the war, about his time with the partisans, he would tell them about the wedges. He would explain the simple physics of derailment, the careful calculation of where to place a piece of metal, the risk and planning required for each operation. He would tell them that resistance did not always require grand gestures or dramatic heroism, that sometimes the most effective weapon was a $2 piece of metal and the knowledge of how to use it. But he would also tell them about the cost. He would remind them that every act of resistance during the occupation carried consequences for the entire population, that the fight against tyranny was never clean or simple, that the choices made in desperate circumstances were always more complex than they appeared in hindsight. He would tell them that he had done what he believed was necessary, what he hoped had saved more lives than it cost, but that he carried the weight of those decisions with him always. The railroad tracks across Belarus were rebuilt after the war. The damaged sections replaced, the derailment sites cleared and restored. Trains once again carried passengers and goods instead of weapons and soldiers. Mikhail returned to work on the railways, using his knowledge to help rebuild the network he had once worked so hard to disrupt. It was strange to repair what he had spent years destroying, but it was also a kind of redemption, a way of restoring what the war had torn apart. On quiet evenings, he would sometimes take a walk along the tracks near his home, examining the joints between rail sections, checking the tie plates and fastening systems. To anyone watching, he was just a railway worker doing his job. But in those moments, he would remember the 40 trains, the 40 times he had placed a simple wedge and changed the course of events, 40 small victories in a war that had cost millions of lives. The arithmetic was never simple. It never would be. But standing on those tracks in peacetime, watching trains pass safely, carrying people home to their families, Mikhail believed that what he and his fellow partisans had done had mattered. They had found a way to fight back when resistance seemed impossible, to inflict damage on an occupying force that appeared invincible, to contribute to the eventual liberation of their homeland. The cost had been terrible, the choices morally complex, but in the end they had helped ensure that the occupation did not last forever, that tyranny was not permitted to stand unchallenged, that future generations could live free from the nightmare that had consumed their lives for those years of war. That was the legacy of 40 derailed trains and one determined man with nothing but ingenuity, courage, and a $2 piece of metal. Not a story of glory or heroism, but a story of what ordinary people do when faced with extraordinary evil. They resist, they fight, they pay the price, and they help ensure that tomorrow might be better than today, even if they themselves bear the scars forever.